Today I'll be introducing a type of video in which I'll be talking about different forms of media or different types of art that are related to mental health stuff. And I'll just be sort of offering like a media analysis or my own interpretation of this through the lens of mental health and through my own interpretation, my own perspective. So yeah, the book I'll be talking about today is a book I read recently. This book called Unhinged by Daniel Carlat. And yeah, so first I'll just share a little bit about my format here, how I'm setting things up, and then I'll share about the book. So my setup for these, in particular with books, my setup for books is first to talk about my takeaways or to look at the book through its own perspective and things that I am taking away that were helpful, things that I gained as a result of this experience of engaging with it. Then I'll be looking at areas of growth for the book as a piece of like, where do I perceive there were some gaps in the reasoning or what was presented. Just things that are maybe areas for to get more of the picture, as well as like, just to learn more that wasn't talked about. Maybe gaps in like what the author was conceptualizing, which leads to the final one, which is points of ideological disagreement, which are those like foundational conceptual differences that I have with the author. And then those will be very related with the areas of growth, because some of those things which maybe are not being presented might lead one to have a different ideology if they were presented, or like it is an ideological decision what information is being included. Okay, but I do like to let's start with like, what are the takeaways from the book itself? Take it on its own merits first. Okay, so first, a summary. So Daniel Carlat is a psychiatrist, and this book essentially is talking about corruption within the field of psychiatry. And it's an important thing to talk about because it is real, and I think it's also important to have people who are talking about this from within the field. Part of what will come up with that, as I'll talk about more later in the video, is how, because he's an insider, there are certain things which he is not seeing. Starts off with a critique of the process of becoming a psychiatrist, going to medical school. He talks about how like psychiatrists don't really use the knowledge that they gain in medical school. A lot of he goes on and talks throughout the book about just like, what does a psychiatrist actually do? A lot of it is like making very subjective judgments about like what medications might be helpful, and there isn't like really like a medical component to that. Like he talks like there's a lack of knowledge. He says there's a lack of knowledge about how the brain functions. There's a lack of knowledge about how antidepressants or antipsychotics work. So being a psychiatrist is really like a lot of trial and error, and like going to med school is like a lot of skills that they don't end up using, which is maybe not helpful, maybe not like what would lead to the best form of psychiatry. So after talking a little bit about the process of becoming a psychiatrist, he talks about the history of different types of treatment, like some early like mental health treatments, which I do want to talk at length about. So sort of like the history of like first like, and this is like within the context of like Western European society, because because that's like where psychiatry is coming out of. There are other more humane forms of treatment in other types of societies, but it sort of starting off as like viewing mental mentally ill people as like animals or as sick, and like sort of like housing them away, housing people away, and then, you know, trying to treat people. And some of those treatments involved are like, you know, essentially like giving them brain damage. Like there's like a consistent pattern of giving people brain damage and saying that they're better when they really are just like unable to complain. That's not all of the stuff he's talking about. That's some stuff I'm adding in from other places. Next, he talks about the importance of medications, which is like a shift in the field, as like psychiatry used to be a little bit more accepting of psychodynamics or psychoanalytic theory, which is like harkening back to Freud, that there was like talk therapy was like more of a thing that was more common for psychiatrists to do. But now, especially with the input of the big pharmaceutical companies, psychiatrists are shifting much more heavily towards prescribing medications, and financially they're getting a lot of benefit from that. So he talks also about like the direct advertising of drugs to psychiatrists, and how a lot of their prescribing practices, like, they don't even have access to, but like the way the industry is set up, the big pharma companies have like down to like all the numerical data of like what psychiatrists are prescribing what, and then they will come and like give them gifts and take them on like fancy conferences and like pay for their hotels, as a way to like just prime them. And there's an expectation that that'll pay off, and often it does. Also, he talks about like certain forms of research that are like that where there's like a conflict of interest, but that this research is created to support diagnostic categories, and then to say that from these diagnostic categories, medications are the results. Like he talks about like the sort of rise of ADHD, and how like there was a certain group of doctors who were very important in creating that research, but how they were being paid by like the pharmaceutical company, and so that research is compromised, but everyone sort of just looks the other way. And yeah, basically how he goes into how there's like so many people are like, basically it's like very difficult to be a psychiatrist and not to get money and sponsorships from pharmaceutical companies, he talks about. So that's something that everyone in the field sort of has to like engage with at some point. And because of the medical school framework, they're very much thinking in terms of biology. So that's how psychiatrists are conceiving like people who are going through struggles. They are primed to look at this through the lens of biology, which from my perspective is extremely limited at best. Dr. Carlat sort of ends the book talking about, this is a perspective he has, saying psychiatric medications and therapy are equally helpful for people depending on what they need. That's his perspective. And that he is encouraging psychiatrists to lean more into what he calls new advances in therapy, but what that means is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy has its own issues. His perspective is, it's the most research supported, and like that's sort of where his inquiry ends. But it's also worth questioning and looking at what is that research saying, who's funding it, those sorts of questions. Okay, so that should be enough of a summary. So now let's talk about some takeaways that I'll take from this book, and also I'll have additional sources in the description. So one takeaway for me is just how arbitrary diagnostic categories are. Maybe I will throw up like the DSM here so you can see. Maybe I'll do that later, some other video. But yeah, I think really like talking about how essentially like the way that people are diagnosed is you have a collection of like very subjective like experiences, symptoms, and then if you check off enough here, you're this. or also sometimes there's like 2 lists and you have to check off enough from like both of them. And it's very subjective, like how we define both what we're experiencing and then how like, the psychiatrist is interpreting that. So talking about like, there are so many different ways to categorize the same experience. It's all about like the stories we tell about it, that diagnoses are very like, there's a lack of repetition in how different psychiatrists will diagnose the same person having the same experiences, because it's very subjective. It's like, there's not a complete history of diagnostic categories. I would love to talk more about that at some point, but sort of looking at like how they're a social construct and how like essentially it's like describing a cluster of subjective experiences that like a lot of people, we then take that to mean like this is our identity, and like it becomes its own thing that feeds into itself and supports like its own continuing existence. Diagnostic categories are arbitrary. Next, medications rely on faulty science and self-reports. So the vast majority of the research that's done on the efficacy of psychiatric medications is paid for by the company themselves, and their category for who is included is like extremely stringent, and then it's so much stringent that often it's very hard to have a category of people who like have a diagnosis but haven't previously been on medication, or like frequently it's like the category is like, we need people who've been on like one medication before, when the reality is like people tend to have multiple, like, go to a doctor, go to a psychiatrist, try one, it doesn't work, try another, and like, so they're not testing what it actually would be like for someone to have, to what it would be like in practice for someone to be switching from something else to this medication after already going through several. Also, a lot of studies that are testing how helpful these medications are testing within like a 6 or an 8 week period, and people are on them for many years. And the sort of thing that we're told is, stay on these for the rest of your life. You need these. It's like insulin for diabetes, right? Like that's the narrative, and that's not what's being tested. And so like a lot of these side effects that don't come up immediately, like tardive dyskinesia, or like jitters, or like other types of things that come up that tend to take some time, that are not always talked about with people in advance. And I think also because the science is like intentionally avoiding talking about these things. And then the last piece I'll say about how the science is faulty is that a lot of it relies on self-reports. And if you're looking within like an 8 or a 6 or 8 week period, so like it's very subjective to interpret what people are saying. And a lot of this research is like questionable, like, is this better than a placebo? Or like, what does it mean when like someone's coming in and it's very clear that, the person you're working with wants to see a particular result? That influences like how you present and how they're interpreting what you're saying. Whereas like, from my perspective, it takes a long time to like move through like a cyclical pattern of starting to improve in certain ways, and then something happens, and then what do we do with that, and then like having bad stuff happen, and then something improves again. Like it's a very cyclical process, and sort of what they're selling is like that it won't be, because they're not looking over a full cycle. They're looking over like one period and like saying like, how much can we just jack up how good you're feeling in 6 to 8 weeks? That's what they're looking at. The last takeaway from this book is that he was talking about, it's like, this is my word, psychiatrists have a bit of a complex, in that there's a feeling of being inferior to other like medical professionals due to how little science there is that has definitive answers about brain stuff. And part of this is because our conception of the brain that's distinct from the rest of the body is a little ridiculous. And even just the rest of science saying that organs are separate systems and not all part of an interconnected system that's our body that's connected to the environment. It's like ridiculous to be separating these things. But it is the most ridiculous with saying that the brain is separate from everything. So there's an inferiority around psychiatrists like not knowing stuff. But then there's a superiority around talk therapy because, we're medical. Like, I have worked in settings where it's always like, the psychiatrist is like in charge, or like run this by the psychiatrist. There is a hierarchy within the mental health field. Psychiatrists are at the top. Why? Because of the medical stuff. And so they can be sort of defensive to perceived encroachments on their scope of practice, which is very narrow. Why? Because again, we don't know. We don't know these things about the brain, in part because of how we're conceptualizing what the brain even is, or what the mind is. So yeah, Daniel Carlat talks about electroconvulsive therapy and how psychiatrists are sort of defensive of maintaining this as a treatment option because it is the only thing that they do that is like theirs, that's like medical. But even then, like, there are nurses on call and the nurses will respond if there's anything that happens. Like, the psychiatrist is there like almost like for theater. And the science of, he doesn't talk about this, the science of electroconvulsive therapy are also like magnets. I'm very skeptical of that. Like, I would say steer clear of that stuff. Okay, so next we'll talk about areas of growth. So my first area in which there was like a clear something missing in this book was that there were no conversations with survivors of the mental health system. There were no conversations with people who had these treatments, had these experiences. Like when Dr. Carlat is talking about his own practice, he's really speaking on behalf of people. He's like saying his perspective on that, but then when he goes and he interviews like, you know, these industry leaders, people who are the heads of whatever organization, or people who have like gotten notoriety for, you know, being in the field for whatever reason, it's very noticeable that he's talking to experts and he is not talking to people who have been exposed to psychiatry in any sort of way. So that's for me, that's a red flag. Like, how can you be making these pronunciations if you're not talking to the people who are actually going to be most affected? And I'm going to link a documentary in the description of someone who has done that. Daniel Carlat, who is an ex-therapist and is a current YouTuber who I follow, has made a number of documentaries directly talking with people about their own experiences. So I would say check that out. The next area of growth for this piece is that there is no answer for the corruption and also no explanation for why it's happening. For me, it's very clear that this is like the influence of capitalism, and that essentially the role of psychiatrists within I'm jumping into ideological disagreements. Oh well. This is about the role of psychiatry within the field, or within capitalism, in that we are making biological the suffering that is socially caused, and then we're medicating it. And so this is a big moneymaker for the pharmaceutical companies because they are medicating our despair. And then there's just no end to that. Like, it's infinite profits for them. And then the psychiatrists are like like one of a number of a group of different types of professionals who essentially can skim off of this pie. So there needs to be an answer for that corruption that involves fundamentally changing the system. Not radical. So he doesn't have an answer for the corruption. But I think like a few things I'll share that would be even like just bare bones without like disrupting the entire system is like regulating. So psychiatrists can't take like these trips that are paid for by the pharmaceutical companies, or like that there aren't free lunches, because this is part of how they worm their toes in everywhere, is like providing free lunches anywhere and everywhere in which they get to talk about their drug, the pharmaceutical companies, to the psychiatrist. So no more free lunches. Revoking licenses from people who are shown to have had a conflict of interest that they are not disclosing, or like even like blacklisting people from academic spaces when they are not disclosing their conflict of interest and they're like doing this research, because he talks about, people just switch jobs, or like the university defends them. It's like there need to be consequences. And even without totally disrupting the system, you can still have consequences. But yeah, essentially, area of growth, not radical. Isn't his perspective of psychiatrists should do more talk therapy is not going to change anything, and it's not going to be adopted either, because there's no money in it to do that for them. So next, ideological disagreements. So already talking about this a little bit, but what is the role of psychiatry within capitalism? I think to a lesser extent also therapists play the same role, as do social workers, as do other types of what's called care workers, people who provide care as their job description. But in particular, because of the biomedical aspect of like turning despair and anger into an individualized biological problem and diagnosing that problem, and then people having this belief that this is like who they are is like to suffer, instead of to say, no, you're suffering because of like these problems that are socially caused that we can find solutions for. I think I'm not completely against people taking medications, psychiatric drugs. I would say that should be up to them, and there should be clear information about what the long-term effects are. And then also there needs to be like just like a shitload of resources that are invested into people's lives, so that this doesn't feel like a do or die option of like, I have to have this because if I don't cope through like when I'm having panic attacks, I'll lose my job. So, having things like housing, healthcare, transportation, food, like getting rid of a lot of debt. These are things that are needed, because then that will like, people will not have as much despair, and they won't need to be medicated if they are supported by society. And essentially that's the role of psychiatry, is like, if society is not supporting you, well, now you can be medicated. And it's just not a long-term solution. So removing this individual biological understanding of problems and correctly putting them in the systems, and then changing those systems, and then what does psychiatry look like after we've done this? Well, I think it would need to be, at minimum, like much, much smaller of a field, in the sense that, people would just not need it as much. But still, I think it should be an option if people want to choose that for themselves. And yeah, again, like in terms of this book, an ideological critique is like not talking about systems of oppression at all. I think, you're talking about despair, you're talking about people who are having major difficulties in their life, and you're not looking at what's causing those difficulties. And like, no wonder his response is to say, we should just do more talk therapy, because if you're not looking at the true root of the problem, which is systemic oppression and all of the harmful effects that has on people, of course your response is to say like, oh yeah, we can just make this tiny little adjustment and everything will be better. Well, this is not the case. So before I finish, a little bit about the role of therapists within capitalism as well. I think to a lesser degree also, but like, talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, which he mentioned, cognitive behavioral therapy plays a similar role in that it's about like correcting bad thoughts and like correcting bad behaviors to, get people to correctly function in society. I think that within therapy, there's a wider range of possibilities. Like certainly the mainstream is playing this role for society of deneutering people's rage and anger and sadness about their situation. But on the other hand, and this is where I'm trying to be in my practice, on the other hand, there are people who are like, we can support you, we're acknowledging the fullness of these harmful systems, and how can we empower? Because that's the fundamental distinction of what makes good therapy, and something which I think is largely absent from psychiatry as a whole is like fundamental belief that things can change. Because if your perspective is everything is biological, how can people heal if their suffering is biologically preordained? So this is partly why I don't believe in this biological perspective. But instead to look at like, obviously we can't undo what's happened to us, and we can't go back in time. But what we can do is to say, okay, from this point forward, imagine you're fully supported, imagine everything goes well. And partially this is what therapy is supposed to do, is provide that support, is to help you connect with other types of people, other types of resources, and to also like, plug into organizing. I think it's a big part of it too. So this has been a book review or a book conversation about Unhinged. I actually got this book from the library. Please use your local library. Did you like this format? Do you like hearing me talk about books? Are there other books, movies, TV you would like to hear me talk about? Let me know. Also, was this helpful to like hear me talk about this book? Let me know. Thanks. And as always, if you like the video, like it. If you're not subscribed already, and you'd like to see more, please subscribe. If you'd like to support me to make more videos, there's a Patreon link in the description. And I'll see you next time.